There was a boy who didn't have a home. There was a family who had nowhere to go through all the hardships. A man with resilience, he came from poverty. He was destined to change. Yeah, he was destined to change. There was a boy who didn't stand a chance. Homeless and helpless, and maybe even hopeless. Somehow, he mustered up the courage and made a better life. There was a boy.
In a world where privilege and opportunity seem to be unfairly distributed, the story of a young African-American boy growing up in poverty and homelessness is one that deserves to be heard. This documentary explores the challenges and triumphs of a young boy navigating a system that seems designed to keep him down. From living in an abandoned building to homeless shelters, this is a raw and honest portrayal of the resilience and strength that can be found in even the most difficult of circumstances. Join us as we dive into the compelling and inspiring story of a young boy determined to defy the odds and create a brighter future for himself.
Dr. McCoy, this is your season as the president of this great college. God bless you.
Well, I was born in Worcester, Massachusetts in March of 1966.
Worcester is a city in central Massachusetts, approximately 50 miles from Boston. The city is known as one of the country's most vibrant and livable mid-sized cities. With a population of more than 200,000 and more than 35,000 college students, Worcester is the second largest city in New England. Worcester's past, however, isn't quite as storied. Through the early 1920s, KKK membership in and around Worcester was growing fast, as was its visibility. There was canvassing, recruitment events, and rallies. Skirmishes also broke out in area towns. The late 60s ushered in urban renewal in Worcester. Before the Plumley Village East housing apartments were located at 16 Laurel Street, there was the Laurel Clayton neighborhood. It was once a neighborhood occupied by nearly 300 low-income black and white families. In 1968, the Worcester Redevelopment Authority asked State Mutual Life Insurance Company to sponsor the redevelopment of the area to get rid of the unsuitable homes. The demolition of this neighborhood not only took away homes, it also took away a sense of community that could not be rebuilt.
The community that I grew up in was the result of urban renewal. Mm-hmm. So in the 60s, many communities across the country were just kind of uprooted through this urban renewal program. And the community called the Laurel Clayton neighborhood, where my mother and her siblings grew up, was kind of leveled, and they built the housing projects there, and they gave people first dibs to come back to the projects after it was built. So my grandmother got an apartment there, and then my mother eventually got an apartment there and grew up there until I was about 13 years old. My mother was really struggling. We got evicted for the first time, first of probably 4 or 5 times, and just kind of struggled there.
In the years following World War II, urban renewal projects swept through cities across the United States, promising to revitalize decaying urban areas and provide better housing and infrastructure. However, the impact of these projects on Black communities was profound and often devastating. As the wrecking ball swung, thousands of Black families were displaced from their homes, and once thriving businesses were forced to close their doors. The promise of new, modern housing often fell short, as many displaced residents found themselves unable to afford the new developments or were excluded from them due to discriminatory housing practices. Moreover, the destruction of these communities had a profound impact on the social fabric of these neighborhoods. Churches, clubs, and other communal spaces that had been central to the fabric of Black life in these areas were bulldozed, disrupting social networks and erasing important cultural landmarks. The displacement and disruption caused by urban renewal had long-term consequences for Black communities. Families were uprooted from their homes and often struggled to find affordable, stable housing elsewhere. The loss of community cohesion and the destruction of cultural institutions dealt a blow to the social and psychological well-being of residents. Furthermore, the projects often exacerbated racial segregation, as Black families were frequently pushed into already overcrowded and under-resourced neighborhoods, perpetuating cycles of poverty and inequality.
Our city very rightly has proud of its history in the American Revolution and was a leading city in the abolitionist movement with some of the leading figures here from our city and our efforts as a stop on the Underground Railway. We point to all that stuff, but we do gloss over some of that really darker history in our city around structural racism, around the very fact of the project that they grew up in. The Plumley Village project was built when they raised the city's leading African-American community, the Laurel Clayton community, a strong, thriving Black community that was ripped down as part of urban renewal.
Yep.
And the reality is that the largest gathering of the Ku Klux Klan in north of the Mason-Dixon line happens in Worcester, Massachusetts. There's an upside to that is that though they were driven out of town by folks coming together, but still there's a dark side that we've struggled with throughout our time. And when even the reality of racism was present here in our school and in our community. And I think his ability to overcome that beyond all the other personal barriers he had to overcome is just, I think, a remarkable testament to who he was and his faith and his leadership ability.
I first met Lester McCoy when I was the presiding elder of the Boston District. He attended the Belmont Street Amy Zion Church, which was the second church on the district. I was there for what we call a quarterly conference, and I observed this young man who was paying strict attention to everything that was going on. That was our first meeting. After that, we had some conversation, and the rest is history.
You know, I didn't know how poor I was until I left Worcester. Obviously, when I was going through those homeless years, I mean, it became very clear that we were not doing well. It was traumatic. Obviously, I didn't realize how traumatic until later. And I think I really had some PTSD.
Because what happens is when you do encounter some of those challenges, it is a trigger. So I did have some trigger moments reminding me of what it was like when we were very, very poor and being hungry. I mean, I was hungry a lot. Like we never got enough food. So even though I was resourceful at many times, you know, going to soup kitchens and other places, there were times when I couldn't get that food or get access to that. So you can imagine when you encounter some lean times, it's a trigger for you, you know, to kind of remind you of those very dark days.
I played sports coming up. I was an athlete, played basketball, football, and baseball. Baseball is my first love. And, you know, I was out there with all my friends, grew up in the boys club during those days. Between the three constants that saved my life were church, school, and sports. Those three things really guided me. So I learned teamwork. I learned dedication. I learned hard work. I learned discipline, you know, and I think that helped me through the very difficult times and gave me a sense of resilience to be able to leave a very poor environment. And it literally was about survival, right? I mean, I stood in soup kitchen lines. I went to food pantries, all those kind of things, not just for me to eat, but for my family to eat. My mother was really struggling. We found out later on that she was really having some mental health challenges, you know, battling depression and just couldn't get out of that downward spiral. And so as a kid, when you're trying to just make it, you're not realizing the impact that it's having on you. Don't have time to feel sorry for yourself. I mean, the truth of the matter is I had a lot of clothes from Goodwill. You know, I had people who gave me clothes. And so we just had to, you know, try to make it. We always had, my mother had a sense of pride. This is the ironic part of it, you know, like she didn't want people to know, you know, what was going on. And she was, you know, from what I hear from people, she was a sharp dresser, you know, always a good looking lady, well put together. And so she didn't want people to see that. So she kind of passed that down to us.
Yeah.
So we were always, you know, trying to look presentable so that people don't really know. Now, people who knew. My church family knew. My pastor came to our rescue and helped us get another place to live and that kind of thing. And there were people in my church that never judged me. That's the other thing about the village, right? If I had been in another community, I would have been judged. People would have looked down on me, all that kind of stuff.
Right.
I never felt that when I was coming through. I always felt like people cared about me. They were compassionate, and they were still pushing me. Like, they wouldn't let me get away with stuff just because I was poor and homeless.
Right.
It was like, no, you got potential, so we're going to keep pushing you. So all of those things helped me. And I always say it's really the grace of God. The last thing I'll say about that, my pastor literally took me into the parsonage with him. So the last time we got evicted, I was so upset and ready to give up. I had a quarter in my pocket. Like, my kids don't even know what a payphone is, right? I went to the payphone and called my pastor, and he asked the essential question, Lester, where are you?
Yeah.
Right? It was more than just my geographic location. And he came and got me and moved me into the parsonage.
Right.
I don't even remember how long I lived with him. It might have been a year or so, but his wife cooked for me, washed my clothes. They took care of me. He let me work at the church. You know, I was like the janitor, the sexton at a young age, cleaning up, cutting the lawn at the parsonage, you know, learning those things that growing up in the projects, you don't,
Right.
you know, you don't cut grass, you don't take care of stuff. So he literally saved my life.
That I remember coming home. I would go to my grandmother's after school, and my mother would come and pick me up. And apparently she had been out that day and picked us up and brought us back to our apartment, which was only a couple of blocks away. And she put her key in the lock to open the door, and it wouldn't work. And so she kind of fumbled around. Of course, now in hindsight, I realized she was embarrassed. And she probably knew that she had gotten notices in the past that there were threats of eviction, but probably didn't think it was going to happen. And that day we stood there in utter shock, my baby sister and I. And so my mother just said, well, let's go back to grandma's.
Remember, first off, we moved into my grandmother's apartment, who also lived in the projects, and she was raising 3 kids.
Yeah.
Their mother died when she was very young and left 3 kids, and my grandmother was raising them. So then my mother, me, and my sister moved into this apartment.
How many bedrooms?
It's a 3-bedroom apartment in the projects, all of us on top of each other.
Yeah.
And my mother and grandmother started, you know, battling, and they basically fell out with each other. So we had to get out, ended up in a homeless shelter. That shelter, by the way, still exists in Worcester, Massachusetts.
Really?
I think it's called Abby's House. And it was a shelter for women and children. So they took us in there. If I'm not mistaken, we lived there probably 2 or 3 different stints.
Yeah.
You know, and after a while, it's like, okay, you need to get back on your feet. So they helped us get on our feet, got another apartment, same cycle all over again, and got evicted again. So during that period, they're also the government, this is during the Reagan years, right? So they're trying to cut welfare and all of that, making people get off, and you got to go get a job. And so my mother was kind of struggling through that. So we didn't have the safety net. Obviously, we don't have my grandmother anymore, and she had a brother, my Uncle Joe, who she fell out with him. So we really didn't, other than the church, you know. And after a while, you don't want to keep going to that well, you know.
Right.
We need help again. Can y'all, you know, raise a ministry of kindness offering, help us get another place? So after a while, you become like the boy who cried wolf.
Yeah.
you know, and so it got worse. It got worse. I was actually a squatter in an abandoned building. We were living in a place that had a fire, and everybody had to get out. And at that time, I don't know what happened to the landlord or what happened, but they never really checked on us.
Yeah.
And we were squatting in that building.
Man.
You know, no heat, no lights. We were just kind of making it till we could get to the next place. And I was working jobs here and there. Obviously, I became the man of the house at a very young age. And so I was protective, even though I didn't really understand what I was doing. She's 7 years younger than me. So obviously there's a great difference. And, you know, by the time she got to, you know, adolescence, my mother had gotten on her feet. And all of that weighed on her very heavily. And so my sister, you know, was her partner. You know, they were very close, much closer than I was to my mother. And I think that's just the result of all of the transitions that happened in our lives. And there were periods where I was separated from them. And so that incident where we were in an abandoned building, basically squatters in the building. I remember in the dark, just praying and hearing God say to me that this is not the end and that I'm going to use this for your good. And that to me, because I feel for my life, it's different for other people, but my call to ministry was a dynamic call. It wasn't a one-time call. God kept calling me. And so it was at the time, I guess, I began to hear God's voice in those desperate moments. And then when I would get to church, you know, I could see myself while I'm watching the preacher, I could see myself in the pulpit. And so at 15 years old, I acknowledged that I had a call on my life, that I felt like God was calling me to preach, and I didn't know what to do with it. But I told my pastor what was going on. And I remember my Sunday school teacher, Louise Bertha Baskerville. She was a saint. She had been the superintendent of Sunday school, and she taught me so much about the Bible. I learned hymns from her in Sunday school. And Mother Baskerville got sick and wasn't able to come to church every Sunday. So I couldn't see her regularly, but when she came, you knew she was there. And I guess my pastor on a particular Sunday announced to the congregation that little Lester had acknowledged his call to preach. And Mother Baskerville was in church that Sunday. And she started shouting in church, and she got happy. And she took me downstairs to the Sunday school class where we as children used to get our lesson. And she pulled out a little book that had some pictures in it. And there was a picture of a big heart that said, Jesus is in my heart, and it had the initials LM on the picture. And she said to me, I remember when you made this picture, and I knew that God was going to call you to preach. And it was in that moment that I knew that God was real and that God had a plan for my life. And I was glad that Mother Baskerville had lived long enough to see that the seeds that she planted in my life were coming to fruition. And so that gave me a lot of strength in some really dark times.
Lester's nickname was the preacher. He had, you know, his faith was something that he carried with him, that he expressed to friends and to people in this cool community. He talked about his faith, and I know he earned the nickname the preacher, not just because he was an amazing speaker, but we all were aware that he had already begun to take a role in his church as a preacher on Sundays, and certainly as a emerging leader in his faith community?
I met Lester McCorn in 1988, December 1988. I had graduated from Valdosta State College, and I had come home, and I met him in church. And the first time I met him, he had preached at my home church, and we became friends after that. And then a romance started, but it was a little ways.
When I first met Lester, I did not have knowledge of the conflicts in his life. As I saw more of him, had conversation with him and with Dr. Kelly, who was then his pastor, and later on Dr. Robert Johnson, who became the pastor of that church, I began to learn more about his life details and challenges. And I think, like most people, the more I learned of his background and his challenges, the more I was fascinated by him. I was really impressed by his personality. He was always upbeat. He never allowed his history to dampen his spirit.
Dr. Lester McCorn, in 1981, when I started my sophomore year here at Doherty High School, I was stunned later in my life to learn about the struggles that Lester had undergone in his time here at Doherty High School. You would not have known it. He was always impeccably dressed and never had a bad thing or a lack of a smile on his face. He was always positive and engaging and supportive of everyone else. And I had no idea until later in life that I found out a lot of the struggles that he had gone through during his life, especially during his high school years.
Well, honestly, I didn't learn a lot of that until later. You know, we were college students. I just graduated and was trying to find, my rhythm. He was still a student at Morehouse, and he was pastoring. And so we didn't talk about those things because our lives, were busy, being young people trying to figure it out.
It took me perhaps 5 or 6 conversations with him, and each conversations carried us deeper into his life, background, and history.
So it was as time went on that I began to learn about him. We had been dating about a year and a half, and his mom passed away, unfortunately, before I had the opportunity to meet her. And so it was right before that I started to understand some of his childhood and some of what had happened with him as a youngster, but it really wasn't something that we talked about. And so over the course of the 32 years that we've been married, I've learned things piece by piece because, it hasn't been a comfortable conversation.
Well, I learned by observing Lester that he was standing erect and speaking correctly. As I had opportunity to have conversation with him, again, I learned bits and pieces of it. It wasn't that he would run up to you and say, "Let me tell you my life story."
To former pastors and members and people who've known him who've just said to me, like, it's a wonder that he has done as well as he's done. He had it rough. And so, some of what I know, he told me. And then sometimes it's just in conversations with other people who have known him for, long periods of his life.
And he was interesting to be around. He paid attention to everything that was going on. I then learned of his homelessness, of his challenge of being secure. And his pastor, Dr. Johnson, said, "We have to do something to help him." And I was not opposed to that.
And then I do recall, and she's a very dear friend, my friend Parlee. She and I went to daycare together. And then we went to elementary school together and middle school together. We remained good friends, and our parents were friends. So one of those bouts with homelessness, their family took us in. So again, my sister and I, my mother, moved in with Parlee's family, her mother, father, and she had 2 sisters. And we were all in in an apartment. Worcester has these triple-decker houses, and so she lived on the first floor of one of these triple-decker houses in Worcester. And again, they were familiar to us, so I felt like I was living with family, but we still were, kind of crowded in that space. Again, I don't know how I did it. Some of it was peer pressure. Like, I didn't want to be different than everybody else. So I was playing sports, so I think that helps too. I was in student government and in sports. And so those two things made life a little more normal for me. At least I had something to take my mind off of my troubles.
Yeah.
When I go back home to, like, I'll never forget a very embarrassing situation. My sophomore year, I got injured. And so I became sort of like the team manager.
Yeah.
And the coach would come and pick me up because I didn't have transportation. So to make sure that the manager was there, he would come by and scoop me up. And he really didn't know where I lived. Somehow somebody told him where I lived, and he came by. He had another player in the car who came to this. It wasn't really a shelter. I can't even describe what it was, but it was connected to the food pantry that we were going to, and they just gave us a place to live, but we were sharing it with other people. And he came looking for me, and I was so embarrassed that he came into that space, but he never said anything about it.
Wow.
And he didn't say anything to the coach.
Yeah.
And the coach never asked me about my living situation.
Yeah.
But it was things like that I'm negotiating, behind the scenes, trying to live a normal life.
Yeah.
And that's what you have to try to do. So I did that all the way through. Another thing, unbeknownst to me, this is how I feel like people were conspiring on my behalf. My pastor, I didn't find this out until I went back to visit my high school after I was at Morehouse. I went to go see a science teacher who I really liked. And he said to me, this was my clue. He said to me, I'm so proud of you. You're doing so well. Because I know when you were here, you were from pillar to post. And I looked at him like, first of all, I wasn't familiar with the terminology, but I knew he was getting at something.
Right.
And it was his way of saying, I knew you were poor and homeless and struggling when you were a student.
Right.
So I found out later, my pastor went to the school to tell the principal and the guidance counselor, here's what's going on with Lester. So if you see him falling off in school, this is what's happening. And we just want you to be aware of this, that he's not a bad kid.
Yeah.
He's not a bad student. He's going through some rough times. And if you all could just kind of pay attention to that, I think he'll be fine.
I wanted to do more to assist him in remaining stable and staying in school. Dressing for school and going to school became a challenge for him. When you don't know where you're going to sleep, when you don't know what you're going to wear, when you don't know where you're going to eat, most people, when they're in adult years, bomb out. I also learned that he was an A student. And so in my own little mind, I'm wondering, how do you remain an A student given the circumstances that you have when you go home?
I was talking to some of my white colleagues in ministry. It's not quite the same for them. Like in the Black church tradition, you got to have a calling, right? You can't just make up your mind, I think I want to be a preacher.
Right.
In other faith traditions, you can kind of do that. It's a sense of vocation, that I want to do this and I want to do good. In the Black church, you got to have a calling, and you got to give full proof, right? By this, what's called a trial sermon. When I was coming up, we called it a trial sermon. Nowadays, people call it initial sermon. I like trial sermon because it's not that we're questioning whether God called you or not, although there is some question of that, but you got to demonstrate, and people have to license you, right? That's how it works in our church tradition. And so I got my call to preach while I was homeless, while I was a squatter in an abandoned building.
Oh, man.
I heard the voice of God speak to me clearly. And basically, God was saying to me, this is not the end of your story, but this is going to be a part of your story.
Yeah.
And I want to use you.
Right.
And I remember sitting in church, while the preacher was preaching, I'm hearing another sermon that I'm supposed to be preaching. I could see myself standing in the pulpit. It was that kind of thing at 13, 14, 15 years old. So at 15, I accepted the call. I preached my trial sermon at 16 years old and got my first church as a pastor at 20 years old.
I was, with the permission of the then bishop, I was a person who handed that appointment to him. So I was very much involved in that process. And in several other appointments in his ministry before I became a bishop, I was sort of in the background making sure that his name was being considered. And so the rest is, once I became a bishop, I was pleased to put several appointments into his hands.
And when I got ready to graduate from high school, I was actually sitting down talking to Bishop Brown. He was then presiding Elder Brown. This is before he became a bishop. But Mrs. Brown was asking me about what I was going to do after I graduated. Where was I going to college? She just assumed I was going to college. And I said, I don't really know. I mean, I want to go to college, but I'm not quite sure. And she said to me, have you considered Morehouse College? And I was like, Morehouse? What is that? And she said, well, it's an all-black school, and it's the school that Martin Luther King went to. So, of course, she had my attention then. And I said, tell me more. And she said, well, it's in Atlanta, Georgia, it's HBCU, it's all male. And I said, oh, no, I don't want to go to an all-male school. But then she said to me, well, Spelman College is across the street, and that's an all-women's school. And I said, oh, well, tell me more.
Yes, when Lester got ready to graduate from high school, he needed a suit. And I was in a position to make that happen and dress him for his graduation.
Yeah, it's an amazing journey. So again, my presiding elder's wife says to me, you should go to Morehouse. I apply, right? And to be honest with you, D, it's the only school I applied to. I need to put all my eggs in this basket and see if I can. And I got in. And again, my guidance counselor, here's the other thing. He might have been the only African-American high school guidance counselor in Worcester, Massachusetts. He was at my high school. So he helped put together my package to go to Morehouse. I don't really know how to apply to college. I'm the first generation college student. I had done okay as a student. By my senior year, I had picked my grades back up again. I was in honors classes. Before I got to high school, like elementary school, junior high school, I'm like one of the smartest kids. Like I'm doing really well in school. I loved school, and you could tell I was a student leader, all of that. But by the time I'm, 14 years old, 13, 14, we're evicted. I'm spiraling. So it's hard for me. I'm still doing my best, but I'm not at the top of my game. I'm not at the top of my class. I'm also going to school with a lot of smart kids. I mean, they're well off, middle class, upper middle class kids who are doing well, they're going to be all right. And so again, because I'm competitive, I'm trying to keep up with them. So finally by senior year, I'm doing okay. I did fairly well on my SATs. I think I got like 1,000 on my SATs, and, comparing it to your demographic, your peer group, I'm looking pretty good. I'm a student leader. Somehow I got elected senior class president. So I had that, I had my church stuff. So I think all of that made me look like a potential man of Morehouse.
By then we were having a different kind of conversations about, I want to go to Morehouse. Well, Morehouse is not a slouch school. It's a very difficult school. It's a transforming school. So during those conversations, I committed, along with Dr. Johnson, to making his going to Morehouse a practical, non-stressful situation.
From the basement of Springfield Baptist Church in Augusta, Georgia, former slaves emerged from the bondage of slavery to become doctors, lawyers, teachers, preachers, and leaders in the Black community. And God looked down and saw what he created was excellent, and he ordained the journey. And more than 150 years later, the journey continues. And today, that journey is led by Morehouse men.
Dear old Morehouse, dear old Morehouse, we have pledged our lives to thee, and will ever, yea, forever, give ourselves in loyalty.
because I couldn't get my room, I couldn't get registered. And so we sat there to give our sob story, and I was not the only one. So we sat for hours to finally see the business manager. And when we got in, I'll never forget, Reverend Wright said to Mr. Wiley Purdue, the business manager, that this young man doesn't have any money, but he has a whole lot of promise. And if you let him register, he's going to make you proud one day. And I will go back and help raise the money for his tuition, for him to attend Morehouse. And it worked. I got through the first semester all right. Second semester was a little shaky, but in January, they had the annual Martin Luther King service in the city of Worcester. And I always gave the I Have a Dream speech. Always got a standing ovation. Of course, I wasn't there in January because, as Reverend Wright said, Lil Lester is at Dr. King's alma mater, Morehouse College in Atlanta, and he needs some help. And so they raised an offering that day enough to help pay my tuition at Morehouse, and they sent the money on my behalf to help me get through that first year at Morehouse College. So while I was a student at Morehouse, I began to find some peer mentors, guys that I really looked up to. I mean, obviously I had, faculty and staff and professors that were mentors for me. Dean Lawrence Carter, who was the dean of the chapel, he became a real mentor of mine. Dr. Aaron Parker was the chair of the religion department and my advisor in religion. But there were students that I really looked up to, guys that were the leaders on campus. And most of those guys that I really resonated with were members of Alpha Phi Alpha. And of course, Dr. King was a member of Alpha Phi Alpha. And so it was really the only fraternity that I considered.
I don't know, 30 years ago, maybe in the fall of 1985, we were becoming fraternity brothers at that time. We were looking at becoming alphas. And so I got to know Lester more and more as we all got to know each other more and more as we went through the entire process. But when I think back about Lester back during that time, there was always something special about Lester. He was always a dreamer. That's what really stands out to me.
When I went away to college, she was 11 years old, and we were not really close. My mother died while I was at Morehouse, and my sister was graduating from high school. In fact, my sister had just graduated from high school when she came home and found our mother dead from a heart attack. And I sincerely believe she died from a broken heart. I just think all of the challenges that she had, and I think she really struggled with some mental health issues that she really wasn't able to cope with and didn't have the support. I mean, keep in mind that she had kind of become estranged from our family. So she didn't have the network that you would hope people would have during crisis.
We were dating, and we had he had asked me to go to Worcester, back home, to meet him. We were both living in Georgia at the time, and it was devastating. He was at church. It was on a Saturday night during our worship service. But when he got the news, I didn't quite understand. My parents were still living. I came from a 2-parent home. And honestly, just the devastation of losing your mom, I saw, what it meant to him. I saw, the people who rallied around him, Reverend Brown, presiding Elder Brown, and his daughters, Anita, who were saying, we got to get him home. And so obviously he was devastated because she wasn't ill. It was very sudden. It was a surprise. And for me, it was just, being his friend and being a support system in whatever way he needed?
Well, first of all, she was my favorite aunt. She was, she was a really cool aunt, but I believe she had a lot of mental health issues that was unknown, really unknown to us. We didn't see it. I didn't see it until later on. But Lester just, he went to school, hung out with his friends, did what he had to do, surviving that. And I don't know, it was hard because I seen what he was going through, and my grandmother at the time that I was living with, I seen the struggles that she went, because that's her daughter, and it was very hard. It was a very hard time.
I never really thought about my father much when I was coming up. I did have a stepfather, and as far as I was concerned, he was my father, even though he didn't stay in our lives for very long. He and my mother were married for maybe 3 years. I don't really know. I was very young. He was my sister's father, and shortly after we moved into the projects, after the housing projects were built and we moved back in, my father and mother separated. My stepfather and mother separated from each other, and I never saw him ever again. So as far as I was concerned, he was the only father that I knew. It wasn't until later on that I really began to contemplate who my father was. And my mother never talked to me about him. So as far as I know, I did not meet him. I do not know anything about him, and he had no involvement in my life. I don't blame him for, what happened in our lives. I just, because I had grown up with friends who also had single parent households with mothers running the house. So, and we all know strong Black women that just do what they have to do to take care of their children and manage their household. So I never really dwelled on the fact that my father wasn't there. Were there times that I wish I had a father? Absolutely, especially playing sports. I mean, what kid doesn't want to have their dad come and cheer them on the field or on the court? The blessing in disguise is that I developed resiliency during that period. It's just what you do to survive. I'm sure I battled some depression. And as I alluded to, it wasn't until I got to Morehouse that I realized that I had overcome a lot to get there, and that I did have moments of loneliness and despair and just kind of being overcome by the sort of the accumulation of all of this stress in my life.
Well, I've always been amazed with Lester. I mean, when you stop and you take a look at what people have to go through, and you kind of look at yourself, and even though you realize you might have had some difficulties, when you really see and take the time to understand where someone else has been, sometimes you actually realize that you are more fortunate than you even thought, because the idea of being homeless is pretty traumatic just within itself. So yes, I was always amazed that Lester was able to do what he has done and what he's always done, considering where he came from.
Well, Dr. King is the single most influential personality in my life, although I never met him. When Dr. King was assassinated in 1968, I was 2 years old. But obviously, his legacy had an impact on the entire country and the world, but in a strange way, it had an impact on my life. I started learning the I Have a Dream speech when I was 10, 11 years old, and I would give that speech all over. It started in church, I think at a Black History program. Not only is King's statue looming large on the campus, the legacy and spirit of Benjamin Elijah Mays was still on that campus. And I remember when I learned about him, I said, it's one thing like a lot of the guys that went to Morehouse who had dreams of being like Martin Luther King, I started saying, I want to be like the man who mentored Dr. King.
Lester had a much more serious side to himself. I mean, as I said, he was a big dreamer. This guy was always very political. He was always interested in talking about becoming a senator or a president. But what was most interesting about Lester is, you know, while many of us were sleeping in on Sunday mornings, Lester was actually going to a church while we're in college where he was a minister. And so Lester was also interested in saving people's souls.
You know, as I was involved in student leadership, you know, a lot of the alphas were you know, running the yard, as they say. Well, while we were there, Spike Lee, who was just getting his feet wet in Hollywood, he had done a movie called She's Gotta Have It. And of course, that was popular among college students. And we were taking a look at this guy, Spike Lee, who was a Morehouse alum. And either his second or third movie was this movie, School Days. And he decided to film it on Morehouse's campus. And he wanted to incorporate as much of a realistic feel of HBCU life. And that included fraternities and sororities.
Well, it was an exciting time. You know, Lester was a part of our step team. I wish I could say I were on the step team, but unfortunately I had 2 left feet. So I was not a part of the step team. I was also studying for my MCATs at that time, but it was an exciting time to have the idea that they were actually filming and producing a movie right on campus while we were there.
But there are these scenes in the movie, and Spike decided that he would incorporate some of the fraternities and sororities on campus. In fact, he decided to have a step show as a competition. And of course, the Alphas won the competition, and I was on the step team. And so there were 8 of us, I believe, that ended up, you know, being in that scene, that iconic scene. Once they went to production, the sound didn't give you the full sound of a step show. You know, the feet pounding on those wooden floors in a gym, in a step show. So Spike Lee decided that he wanted to replicate that sound, and he sent us the video, the Brothers of Alpha Phi Alpha, to learn the steps of the other groups that were in that step scene. And so we got the video, we went out and practiced and learned the steps, and Spike Lee flew us to New York City to 40 Acres and a Mule studio in front of a big screen and played that scene again with us stepping in sync. So the sound in the movie, in addition to us stepping, the other 2 groups that step, the sound is actually us.
You know, we left college, and Lester was always a minister and that sort of thing, but he met the love of his life, Charlene, I think before we even finished college, and he got married. But Charlene's always been by his side. Lester, I believe, grew up without a dad in his family. And so I think it's always been super important for him to be that father figure that he never had in his own family.
So I had a vision, as I mentioned, of being a college president one day. It was during my Morehouse days that I got bit by the bug to be a college president. And I didn't know how and when it was going to happen, but I knew that if I kept pursuing my education, I could at least get the academic credentials that would, put me on the path. To be honest, I came to the presidency in a very unconventional way. Usually you come up through the ranks of academia as a professor and or an administrator, a dean or provost or vice president. I didn't have any of those experiences. And I was talking to one of our bishops. In fact, he's now my board chair, Bishop Monroe. Well, have you considered Clinton College? And I was like, Clinton? No. What's going on? And he said, well, Clinton is going to need some new leadership soon. And, you should take a look at that. He said, I'm going to talk to the board chair, who was the current Bishop Hines, was the chair of the board. He said, I'm going to talk to her and tell her of your interest. And so long story short, we had some conversation. She knew of my interest. And when they had come to a crisis and had to remove the president, they called me. They had a vote, a unanimous vote, to make me the acting president of Clinton College.
We were on vacation. I was in Georgia, and he had gotten a phone call from Bishop Mildred Hines at the time to invite him to come to Rock Hill, and he had come down, and then he called me and said, I just got the keys to the college. And I was like, what do you mean you got keys to the college? And he's like, I have the keys to the college. You know, I've been asked to become the interim president. And so at the time we were living in Baltimore, and that was something that we were not, anticipating. It was, surprise. But it was also not a surprise for me because from the time I've known my husband, always in academia, educated, well-educated, and not necessarily, when I say that, it's not because of the schools that he's gone to, educated because there has always been a thirst for knowledge and for learning, and that's something that, again, I look up to him for, because there's always a book in our house, a book in his hand, a book in his phone, whether it's a Kindle or whatever, so the space that he was in and that he was invited to be in, it's not surprising.
Privilege and honor to be at his inauguration as president. And as you know, at these inaugurations, they invite the really established leaders of all these HBCUs from around the country. And I must say that there were some incredible people that spoke, but when Lester got up, I mean, he rocked the room. He carried it, and surrounded by, obviously, some of the most esteemed and accomplished ministers within the different faith traditions that were there. It was just remarkable, that evolution as a leader. And then I know his passion for education and opportunity, not forgetting his past, and in a sense has paid that back hundreds of times over for so many other young people, both in his work in ministry and now in education. I think is just a great testament, and it just makes us, I think, honored all to know that we were in some small part of his life.
Well, as I said, Lester has always been a leader. In fact, his line name was the Prophet. And so we always knew that Lester was going to do great things, because I and my line brothers, I think I could speak for them, we've always been very proud of Lester, and what he's done with his life, his family, has just been amazing. We've all been in awe. Frankly, I'm very proud to have a line brother who's a president of a college. It's not anything I'd ever dreamed of, but it's been exciting to see what's been happening with Lester. And, I'm excited to see what happens in the future. I mean, he may one day become a senator or president of the United States, for that matter.
We've been at small churches with congregations of 200. We've been at larger churches with congregations of 1,000. And I can honestly say there has not been a difference in the number of, there's been a difference in the number of the congregants, but in terms of how he leads, how he pastors, how he loves, how he directs, and how he dreams, it's always been big. It's always been magnificent. He always sees the best part of a congregation, even when other people look at it as maybe a dying congregation.
Dr. King was my idol. In fact, not everyone knows this, but Dr. King's dream was to be a college president.
Really?
He went to get he went to get this PhD at Boston University. You don't need a PhD to be a pastor, right?
That's correct.
Yeah, he went to do the PhD because he wanted to be a college president. Benjamin Elijah Mays, who was his mentor at Morehouse, Mays is the one that convinced him to go into ministry. King wanted to be a lawyer. He did not want, like many preachers' kids, he was running as far as he could from preaching, right? Not that he didn't love Daddy King. You know, he looked up to him, and Daddy King's friends, all of them saw something in Lil Martin. You know, they saw it, but he was like, I don't want to do that. I don't want to be a black preacher. I want to be a college president. So he, you know, prepared himself for that. He made a hard decision while at Boston University towards the end, that he wanted to go into, he'd already decided he was going to go into ministry because he had gone to seminary, but he decided he was going to be a pastor and use that, you know, as his launching pad. And so he made a hard decision to go to Montgomery, Alabama, to take that church, and the rest is history.
Everything that he does is a level of excellence, from the way he dresses to the way he speaks, the way he carries himself. There's always a level of excellence. I remember, you know, us traveling, and he always say, look like you're going somewhere. So even if it's just, you know, jeans, there's a blazer, you know, and that's something that Reverend Brown and Pop taught him. And he has these, you know, stories. He's such a wonderful storyteller. And he always talks about, you know, how they impressed upon him that, you know, to look like where you're going, not necessarily where you are. And so with him, with excellence, that is carrying yourself a certain way, speaking a certain way, being present when you're around people, being a listener, being engaged. And so excellence is who he is. It's not just a mantra. It's not just a motto for him. It's in everything that he does. It's to the highest quality. And for him, if you're not going to do your best, then don't do it at all. He'd just rather you not do it than to come halfway or to come, you know, 3/4 of the way. It's just give it your all. And that's what he does.
I'm that guy that likes to take little and try to make it much.
Yeah.
You know, I love a challenge and I love building. And so I saw nothing but potential at Clinton. You know, I knew that it was going to be a heavy lift because it's a very small school, low endowment, not a lot of resources, and zero notoriety, right? No one knows about Little Clinton College. And still to this day, I go places and people are like, that's an HBCU?
Yeah.
At Rock Hill, South Carolina? How come I've never heard of it? And so it gives me an opportunity to talk about it as if it's a new school, because in a real sense, Clinton is a new school.
Right.
I mean, it is
being
literally
introduced.
being transformed, being introduced to the world. And now I get excited and have a little sense of pride when people say, I heard about Clinton.
Yeah.
You all are doing this, this, and this.
Right.
You know, we were the only HBCU last year. We may not have been the only, but we were the first HBCU to give free tuition to all of our students during COVID.
Yeah.
We took the money that we received from CARES money and American Rescue Plan dollars and other support that we got. We got some foundational support, corporation support, and we turned around and gave it to the students.
Man,
right?
that's great.
So we bought every student a laptop. Every one of them has a Microsoft Surface, and they have free tuition for a whole year. So that's one thing they didn't have to worry about. And from that, we began to think about innovative ways. So we used a design thinking model for re-engineering our school. And we began to shift toward more of a human-centered model. Like, what are the needs of our students? And how do we match these students with the needs of the world and the society?
Yeah.
So that a liberal arts education from a small HBCU has maximum value.
Right.
And so we reorganized our school into a work college. So we're now insisting that all of our students who live on campus be in the work program, which means that they've got to get a job on campus or off campus, internships, externships that will in turn pay for their tuition, so that when they graduate from Clinton College, they will have zero debt. Right? That's the plan. You talk about a game changer. This is social mobility in reality, right? It's taking these poor kids, giving them an opportunity, giving them a support, obviously an education that no one can take from them, and prepare them for the real world.
I think that this school has been at the bottom of the totem pole for too long. It's one of the lesser lights of HBCUs that people really don't know about, but it's still serving the same students that everyone else is trying to serve. And in many ways, we're doing much more with much less.
I believe that when you've gone through those struggles in life, and other people see that you've gone through there, it gives them faith, it gives them hope that they can, no matter where they came from, they can live their dream. They can, whatever they want in life, it can happen. You just have to put your faith and believe in yourself. So all those struggles that he had, that you said, he didn't have to tell people that. But you know something? That's part of who he is. That's part of his story. That's part of the struggle that got him to where he is now. And if anything, people are going to look up to that, and they're going to like, you know something? I want to be like him. If he could go through all of this in his life, and now he's president of a college, maybe I can be something too. So I think that gives people hope, and it's a great leadership.
Mm-hmm. Lester has remained humble all these years. Like, he's not shared his story publicly, and he's still done good work.
He sees the big picture. So whether it's ministry, whether it's coming to Clinton, it's always the big picture for him. It's always that next level. What can we do to get to the next level? And I've watched it better than 32 years. We've been married 32 years, but we've been together for 34. And I've just, at every level, it doesn't matter. There's always excellence. There's always expectation. There's always hope. There's always drive for the next best thing, and that's anybody, the people around him. He brings them, he wants to make them better. He wants them to be their best version of themselves. And so, pushing him to do that, challenging himself to do that. But he brings others with him. So I love that part of excellence for him. Is, it's not just me, but he goes back and he pulls people up. And it's like we, it's not me, it becomes we.
So when I came here, I came with the inspiration of Benjamin Elijah Mays, who said the real tragedy in life is not in not reaching your goal. The tragedy is having no goal to reach. He would say that low aim is sin. And when I got to Clinton, I felt like the school was aiming too low. Just trying to get by, just trying to meet the budget, just trying to get students through. And I felt like that was counterproductive. And obviously my Morehouse experience and my Alpha Phi Alpha experience told me that we should always be the best, that we should always be first, that we should always be at the top. And so I changed the language at Clinton to get us to start thinking about being the best, being first, and being at the top. And the only way to get to excellence is to stop making excuses. And so we all learned this poem when I pledged that excuses are the tools of incompetence. And so I began saying to our students that we no longer will offer excuses. But it wasn't just students, it was faculty and staff, that will no longer offer excuses for why we're not doing our best. And when you remove excuses, you'll find that you can do more and greater than you ever could because you no longer have a crutch. You say, like that poem, good, better, best, never let it rest until your good is better and your better is best.
Just overjoyed, and what else could be expected from Lester? Just this is the path that was laid for him through all those trials and tribulations, and he's doing the work that he's been called to do.
Lester is an example of when you have had a hard time and you get to a position of impacting people's lives economically. Nobody has to tell you about how difficult hard times can be.
Everything that he does for our family, for our children, for the community, is revolved around what he endured as a child, as a teenager, as a young man. As I said before, he's very compassionate. He's very intentional about relationships, about fostering relationships. He's intentional about the people who are in his, in his circle. Very protective of our family. protective of our children, protective of people that he loves. So he loves hard, and if he's your friend, you've got a friend for life.
Let me tell you, I was on the phone with every family member and texting, and I was like, wow. I said, my little cousin, my little Lester, who, we used to play in the backyard in Plumley Village and went to church together and everything, all, from Morehouse and, at the churches that he preached at to this. I mean, he's always been a smart man. And I'm like, wow, this is the perfect person to take that college, great places. And since he's been there, so many things that he has done. I'm like, I keep reading about it. I'm like, wow, this is amazing. And when I hear the folks that don't know, when they say, oh yeah, I was thinking about my kid going to Clinton. I said, really? Well, let me tell you about this college and about the person there, the president. I said, you know him? Yes, I know him. And, so like I said, I couldn't be more prouder. I mean, I don't want to cry, but it brings tears to my eyes because he's an amazing, amazing man. Amazing.
Lester's always been concerned about people and how they're doing. And I didn't always know that he was homeless, but now it starts to make a lot more sense as to why he was so much more concerned and always so much more interested and so much more political than the rest of us, because I think he understood the importance of it and why these things made a difference. He knew it firsthand, that these things made a difference in the lives of people.
It was his background of hard knocks that hardened him and sharpened him enough to know that if I'm the president of a school, as if when I'm the pastor of a church, you soon learn what you can do in leadership roles that not only proclaims the gospel, but you teach the gospel, you demonstrate that the gospel is meaningful. It had a small enrollment. It has tripled enrollment. It's just good. He's built new buildings, improved the library, raised more money than anybody else who's been president, as far as I know, in the history of that school.
Believe in God first. Believe in yourself. Your strength will take you far in life. And I think, if anything, Lester has shown us all that. And I mean, I just couldn't think of a better person that we're doing this documentary on.
Mm-hmm. Amen to that.
And just to add on briefly, because they've already said it all, he's walking in love and he is walking in purpose, and honored and humbled to watch him do the walk.
If we're talking about legacy, I think I'd have to think of legacy in two parts. His personal legacy certainly would be that you can be born in very difficult situations, unpleasant situations, where you're not sure where you're going to sleep, don't know what you're going to wear. You don't know what tomorrow holds. When you go to school, when you go home, what's going to be there? Will we be moving tonight? Will we have enough food for tonight? So Lester learned early on how to focus not backwards, but to look forward. I think the other legacy has to be that where you are born and the circumstances of your birth do not determine how far you can rise. He never allowed the weight of difficulty to limit his rising up. I'm just Lester McCoy admirer.
I think people will always remember Lester as being a leader. I think people will always remember Lester for caring for people. I think Lester will always be remembered for just having a special sensitivity toward people who don't have, for those people that are disadvantaged, because he's been there, he's walked in their shoes, and he understands what it's like.
I think when it's all said and done, his legacy will be that he loved people, that he loved God's people, that he loved all people, that he loved people who others counted out, that he loved his family, that he D, why you that he didn't give up on people, that he saw the best in others. And so that's his legacy, is that people who know him will know that they've had a friend, that they've had someone who sought to make them better, someone who tried to make the world a better place. The song, "If I Can Help Somebody as I Travel Alone," if I can cheer someone with a word or a song, if I can show someone he's traveling wrong, then my living shall not be in vain. That is the epitome of who Lester Ajay McCorn is. He has always tried to help. He's always tried to bring people along. He's always tried to cheer people. And for me, as his wife, as his partner, as his friend, that's the legacy that I will always hold near and dear to my heart.
So I want first the legacy to be that I left the school better off than I found it. Secondly, I want it to be a legacy of transformation. I think we've got an opportunity to do something really special in education, adopting a work college model for our students so that our students can learn skills and work while they're in school that pays for their tuition so that they can graduate with very little debt. The student loan debt crisis in America is crippling us, and we've got to do something about it. We've got to make college more accessible and more affordable, and we've got to turn the opportunity of an education into prosperity for the future of our students. So I'm working really hard for that. And then also, I think the third and final thing is I want to lead at Rock Hill an institution that transformed an entire community. The south side of Rock Hill has been disinvested and disenfranchised for a long, long time. Some of it is the result of segregation. And now in many of our cities, we're seeing hyper segregation, even worse than what it was in Jim Crow. Rock Hill is evolving as a city that still has a long way to go. But they've got this gym in Rock Hill known as Clinton College. And so we made ourselves available as a more public-facing institution to address the issues of economic injustice and entrepreneurship in our city. And so I hope that my legacy will be that Clinton College and the Clinton Connection Action Plan led to a long-term strategy of economic and community development, which will change the lives of families surrounding this campus and help us all grow together toward a new future for Rock Hill and for this region.
And so today I'm honored to stand here to present to him and place on him the medallion of the office of president of Clinton College. This medallion, Dr. McCorn, represents your responsibility to the students, responsibility to and for the students, the faculty, and the staff of Clinton College. It also represents the responsibility to the community in which Clinton College resides. This medallion represents the authority, as Dr. Dixon's already said, and Dr. Bishop, Reverend Dr. Hines has already said, represents the authority that's been given to you by the Board of Trustees of Clinton College, by the authority given to them by the great state of South Carolina, by the authority given to it by the Board of the Department of Education. But then, not only that, this medallion represents the continuity, the continuance of the leadership of Clinton College. As its leader in this new season, there are 12 presidents listed here. One day, Dr. McCoy's name will be listed on this medallion, but today, we place it on him, representing his authority, his leadership as the president of Clinton College. Dr. McCoy, this is your season as the president of this great college. God bless you.
Wouldn't have it any other way. Thank you.
There was a boy who didn't have a home. There was a family who had nowhere to go through all the hardships. A man with resilience, he came from poverty. He was destined to change. Yeah, he was destined to change. There was a boy who didn't stand a chance, homeless and helpless, and maybe even hopeless. Somehow, he mustered up the courage and made a better life. There was a boy lost in his mind, all the desperation, he couldn't even cry. Can't cry, 'cause the pain won't go away. A small act of kindness goes a long way. He was destined to change. Yeah, he really made a way. There was a boy who didn't stand a chance, homeless and helpless, and maybe even hopeless. Somehow, he mustered up the courage and made a better life. Who didn't stand a chance, homeless and helpless, and maybe even hopeless. Somehow, he mustered up the courage and made a better life. There was a boy lost in his mind, all the desperation, he couldn't even cry. Can't cry, 'cause the pain won't go away. A small act of kindness goes a long way. He was destined to change.